introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Seema Jaitley, Managing Director of SJ Solutions. Seema has been specialising in pharmacovigilance for 20 years and has headed up global pharmacovigilance and medical affairs before setting up SJ Solutions. SJ Solutions services span both consulting and contracting, provide solutions for drug safety, research, and other affairs relating to the running of a business within the pharmaceuticals industry. She's helped companies in implementing the new EU legislation and is currently studying for her MSc in epidemiology. Seema, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michelle. So welcome, everybody. We're going to talk about medication errors. The reason behind this really is because it's becoming more and more of an area to look into. Two documents were recently published by the European Medicines Agency. This was at the end of last year. One was on the collecting and coding, reporting of medication errors, and then a second document was also produced on risk minimization as well. And we can see that error rates are between 4.8% to 5.3%, so quite a significant amount there. And patients are about 12.3 times per 1,000 admissions likely to have a medication error. So again, you can see exactly how relevant this is. And it's important because medication errors in themselves are usually preventable. Majority of them are preventable. So this really is an area that needs looking into to understand how we can ensure that these preventable errors are managed appropriately so they don't occur. Within the PBRER and the risk management plan, you need to also summarize your medication errors, separately and specifically, again, highlighting how important this area is. So moving on, just to look at definition. So definition of a medication error is an unintended failure in the drug treatment process that leads to or has the potential to lead to harm to the patient. And I think the important thing here is that this is unintended, i.e. not intentional, and can cause harm or the potential for harm. So you don't necessarily have to have an adverse drug reaction occurring secondary to this. Does not include lack of efficacy and does not include those areas where there's intent in some way. So intentional overdose, off-label use, misuse or abuse, there's intent here. That's not a medication error. And there are definitions with regards to the intentional overdose, off-label use, misuse, abuse in GVP Module 6. And indeed, medication error is also covered there as well. Now, within the documentation that's provided by the EMA, they have these diagrams. And I don't know if you can see them too well, but if not, do go to the actual documents that have been that are on the EMA website. And you can see that we've got here potential error. So a potential error is something where you can recognize that circumstances where you could lead to a medication error that may or may not involve a patient. So the term potential medication error is meant to refer to all possible mistakes in the process which really relates to prescribing, storing, dispensing, the preparation for administration, or even the administration of a medicinal product as well by all people that are involved in that process. So it's not just the patient, it's all the way through the process of actually prescribing and then through to administration of that product. You also have here, intercepted error. And here, an intercepted error is really a near miss. So it's where there has been an error in some way, but it's not reached the patient. So this could be where perhaps an IV drug has been made up incorrectly, and then it's been stopped in time before it's actually reached the patient. But again, an important source of information to understand exactly what's going on with the product. You can also have a medication error where there's no harm, so you don't have an adverse drug reaction of any kind. Patient receive maybe expired product, something like that, and nothing happens to the patient. And then you have those where you do have an ADR in some way, so a medication error associated with an ADR. And here we just have the kind of a flow diagram to show the different types of errors. So your potential error here, where you haven't actually, there's a possibility of an error, but it's not actually occurred. Intercepted, where it hasn't reached the patient. error where there's no harm, and then error where you do have an ADR, so there's harm in some way. So if we now look at recording of medication errors, so all of you that are involved with kind of ICSRs or PSUR writing, RMP writing, you'll know how important this is. But recording, you do get medication errors reported to you through spontaneous sources, through the literature, solicited reports as well, and these could even come from non-interventional studies or even registries. Now, where you have an ADR and it's a direct response of the error, that needs to be obviously recorded and then reported as per Module 6. And it needs to be recorded whether it's valid or not. And if you remember, with the new legislation, you do have to ensure that non-valid reports are recorded somewhere, whether that's on your main safety database or not. If it's valid, of course, you'd put it onto your main safety database. Importantly, follow-up is important. We will come on to that in a minute. And within the document, they do talk about the fact that it's good practice to record those without ADRs, but actually you have to record them somewhere. Even though they're not reportable, you do have to record them because you need to summarize medication errors within your risk management plan, within your PBRER, your PSUR, and also from a signal detection perspective as well. You need to ensure that they feed into the process overall, so that if there are medication errors that are occurring, you can review these, assess them, and make changes as needed to, say, your label, packaging, or risk minimization can be put into place. Now, the document itself, and I have focused on the document quite a bit here because they talk about coding. And I think coding is really, really important. It's an area that we definitely need more training on, and without coding these cases or the medication error, even without an ADR appropriately, you're not going to be able to pull out the relevant information to be able to assess what's going on. So actually the document, the first document that they call it document 1, the first one on the coding is very good. It does go into a lot of detail of the different codes that can be used for putting these onto your database or for recording this information. They talk about, of course, MEDRA is used, really kind of everywhere now, and the points to consider is your general document that you would use to ensure that you're coding appropriately, generally, and how to use MEDRA as a whole. Then they talk about the lower level terms that you should use. So you have your system organ class, which oversees different kind of areas, and you have your higher level group terms. You can have your higher level terms, preferred terms, and then lower level terms. So lower level terms are like what's been reported by the person who's reporting that error or that adverse reaction. So what you should use is the lower level term that's closest to the description of the actual error, and these usually sit in the system organ class, injury, poisoning, and procedural complications, and then there is the high level group term of medication errors as well. And then this should be added to the adverse reaction, so you can pull out both the adverse reaction and the fact that there's been a medication error, because otherwise you'd miss that. It would only be in the narrative and you wouldn't be able to pull that out properly if you're looking for all your medication errors. As with good narrative writing, you shouldn't add or subtract anything, so it should just be as reported. And you should identify the stage at which the error occurred, the primary stage, and all stages thereafter. So if it was a prescription and the patient received the wrong prescription, that should be coded, but maybe they didn't actually have the product dispensed, then that wouldn't be coded. But if they had it prescribed and then dispensed and then administered, all of that should be coded appropriately, because then you'll be able to really get into the detail of what's going on within that case without having to read the narrative as a whole. You do have a preferred term, intercepted medication error, and that can be used for near misses. So again, you can pull that out and have a look at your near misses. And when it's a potential error, you should use the preferred term that really does reflect the circumstances or the information that led to that potential medication error. So I think, I mean, I don't know about you, but a lot of the time when I've been in companies, you do see kind of medication error just being used as medication error, or a very broad term being used. And it can be quite hard to actually work out exactly what's going on then, because if you've got 20 cases of medication error, it doesn't really tell you exactly what the issue is. So some further guidance talking about contraindication, and so most of these are related to things that actually aren't medication errors, and kind of how you can still code them, but they should not be coded as a medication error. So when you're looking at contraindications, if you have somebody that gives a medication or takes a medication when it's contraindicated, if it's unintentional, then that is a medication error. But if it's not unintentional, then that's off-label use, that's not an error. Non-compliance, again, it's the intentional aspect that's important. If it is intentional, it's misuse, but if it's not, it's a medication error. Intentional rechallenge, there are situations where somebody is rechallenged with a product because they want to see if the same situation occurs again. That's not a medication error either. And lack of efficacy, we did talk about previously, it's an outcome, and so that shouldn't be coded as an error. Product unavailability, and we do come across this a little bit as well, where supply chain for some reason is not able to put the product on the marketplace, or there's a problem with supply chain in some way. And here you can use the lower level term, drug supply chain interrupted, but again, it shouldn't be pulled out as an error. Now, looking at occupational exposure, this was something that was brought in with the new legislation, as in more specifically, I should say. And usually when you say occupational exposure, you're talking more about the chronic exposure rather than, sudden accidental exposure. However, if there is this situation where it's a sudden accidental exposure in the occupational setting, that could also be a medication error. So moving on, if we look at off-label use, so this is intentional, so not an error. Misuse as well, intentional. However, I mean, one of the examples that they give is maybe, I put table there, that should be tablet, that's an error in the presentation. So the tab should be, could be crushed, and if that was done intentionally because they wanted to use it in a certain way, that wouldn't be a medication error. But if it was crushed because they misunderstood the labeling or weren't quite sure how to use it, then that should be captured as an error. Now, overdosing, and again, I've seen in companies where intentional overdose is captured as a medication error, and that's not really correct because that is intentional. But you do need to capture the unintentional overdoses, because that's where perhaps the label's been read incorrectly, dosing's not been understood, and you've led to a situation where an overdose has occurred unintentionally. Product quality issues is one to think of as well. Not always a medication error, but again, it could be depending on what the issue is. So if you have problems with a dropper, for example, you can't read exactly how much of the product to take because it's hard to see the lines, or the dropper itself is a little bit defective, that would be a medication error because, again, it's unintentional. So you do have to think about that in the context of quality issues. And drug delivery devices. So here, you've got the medication as well as a device, and you do need to look at making sure that you have coded for the device issue as well, because there are separate tests, of course, for the device, and there's separate reporting and looking methods to assess exactly what's gone on and look at the failure, but you should really capture that device issue as part of your coding. Now, one thing they do mention is that there's standard queries medical queries that are being developed, and this is being developed at the moment for medication errors, and this will really help because it will give you an idea of what you should be pulling from your database in a consistent manner so you can retrieve everything that is related to this area. So one thing that's also mentioned is a discussion regarding invented names, and anyone that's registered a product will know that it's really important to ensure that your name is appropriate. And we'll come on to that in a minute with regards to the risk minimization side of things. But what is important is that there's no confusion. So you can't mix your products up readily. It's not easily done. And if there is confusion in some way, and you do get to hear about this, it's reported to you, there is actually an email address that you should report this to. And this is if you have essentially authorized product, and the email address is here. So where this becomes an issue, you should report here. Again, if you have any medication error that's leading to an emerging safety issue, definition is within Module 6, then you should use the email address here. Now, they talk about periodic reporting, and we have said already that you do need to summarize data within, or your medication error details within your PBRER and your RMP actually as well. And what they would expect to see is a description of the error and with the number of occurrences to the data lock point, looking at the root cause analysis, what's been going on, what's actually led to that error occurring, and then what you've done to prevent that occurring in the future, what steps have been taken within the company, and comments around this. So it's not just saying these are the things that we've seen, it's really saying, well, these are the things that we've seen, what could have been prevented, and what could we do to ensure that this doesn't happen in the future. So looking at follow-up now. So follow-up is important. I mean, it's always important to follow up any cases, ADR, medication error without ADR, because you want to ensure that you've classified the case appropriately. You want to understand exactly during which stage of the process the issue occurred. Was it prescribing? Was it the dispensing? Because it's only by understanding that you'll be able to look deeper and see what needs to be changed or amended. You want to look at contributing factors, make sure that you've got all of the adverse drug reactions that have been reported. If there was a potential error, what would have been the harm if it had reached the patient? What other products were involved? And if a device, the batch number as well, so you can go back and do the necessary testing there. And within the guidance, there are some very good examples, and just to show you, I mean, there might be many more in the guidance itself, but you can see here, you've got a child died after accidental exposure to fentanyl patch, fallen off, and then didn't notice that it got stuck to the child. So they give you advice on what terms to use, and then also what you should be looking at maybe from a root cause perspective, exactly what happened, how did that happen. It could be a quality issue, maybe the adhesive isn't right, or it could be that, it was not easy to see. So these are the things that you need to think about that will then help you to understand what changes do need to be made to your medicine moving forward, or your product moving forward. So moving on to risk minimization, this is the second document, and it's fairly similar to Module 16. However, there are some other considerations that do need to be taken into account when you're looking at minimizing medication errors in themselves. So as I said before, most are preventable. We have your routine through your labeling, your SPC, your pill, but things to look at are your product name, your form, method of preparation, route of administration. These are all areas that you need to think about and look at the possibility of medication errors occurring through this. So, if you have a very complicated method of preparation, it's more likely to introduce error, because it's going to be more difficult to do than the norm. If it's something that's slightly different to what you would normally do for a similar product. If you've got a device, of course, you've got the device side of it to think about as well. If you've got a very narrow indication, that's something to think about as well, because you could be giving it to the wrong patient, maybe inadvertently. So, these are the things that you do need to consider for your product when looking at the risk minimization aspect. So if we look at the different process areas, and the process is from prescribing right through to administration, you can see that these are the areas that need to be looked at. So from the prescribing perspective, if it's not clear as to perhaps formulation or the dose, if it's hard to work things out, then who should be receiving the product as well. That may lead to changes perhaps in your labeling or wording, so it is very clear. If you have maybe a modified release or an immediate release formulation, or modified release and an immediate release formulation, you'd want to make sure that it's very clear that they're different, so there's no confusion between the two. Also, considering dosing, where perhaps there's a narrow therapeutic window, it needs to be very clear then what the dosing should be for that product. If you're looking at dispensing, again, cartons, you could get confused between different cartons and could end up giving patient the wrong product. And generics really should have similar size and color of tablets to avoid that kind of confusion. And then, of course, the preparation administration. So if you've got parenteral IV infusions, then you could get errors associated with that if you're mixing it up incorrectly, or if you're not storing correctly, or if you've got multiple dose units. And then, as we said before, device related as well. So these are all areas that need to be considered and thought of and looked at from a risk minimization perspective. So we have your routine and then your additional risk minimization. So routine is usually your label, and it's all about clear instructions, making sure it's very, very very clear as to what with regards to the information that's provided, to ensure that you can use the product correctly from a prescribing, dispensing, administration perspective, that there are no discrepancies and you can see exactly what needs to be done, what the dosing is, patient population. If there is anything slightly different that's needed, it is highlighted. You can also have pack size limits, so if there is a product where overdose could occur unintentionally, then you could put things into place from a pack perspective to limit that. And then you could have information on the pack itself that you wouldn't normally include, but you'd put it in bigger lettering, increased font, so that it's very clear that when you pick up the pack, you can see straight away. For example, here is a penicillin allergy. Additional risk minimization is very similar to other risks, and educational materials appear to be the most common. So again, if you have a product that's quite difficult to reconstitute or complicated, you could have a video to help with that. And then there are dispensing systems that are available as well, so coding, barcoding, and pill identification websites as well to limit then if you're not sure of a product, and you can understand then exactly how to use that product. So there are other areas that could be looked into. Naming, this comes up quite a lot, making sure that you don't have products that look alike or have the same sounding names that can then be taken off the shelf by accident and have very differing indications, and that's a big area that they focus on. And also the types of words as well that are used for your INN, to make sure that you don't have anything in the words that would assume you could use it maybe in a certain indication because of the way that it sounds, when really you can't, and to avoid confusion in that way. Labeling and packaging we've talked about, and the fact that you do have to have extremely clear labeling, and there are lots of things that are included on the packaging. Colour can be used, but you do have to be aware of colour blindness, and more often than not this isn't used as much now, but you could have colour coding where perhaps you've got drugs of similar class that could be together. Colour differentiation where one stands out compared to the others. Colour matching, where you have different components that help match tablets or medications if you need to match them together, but that's not used that much these days. And then you can have illustrations and pictures in the product information, but you have to ensure that these are tested so that you can make sure that they are understood appropriately. There are specific high-risk groups that do need to be considered. So these are the three that are discussed. The pediatric patients, obviously, differing ages, younger ages, size, weight, body surface area. And in this patient population, overdose is quite common because sometimes it can be hard to work out exactly how much of a product or dosing-wise a pediatric patient should receive. And sometimes you also have very complex kind of dispensing calculations or dosing calculations, and that can lead them to overdosing a lot of the time in this patient population. So that's something that does need to be considered when you're looking at your product. Elderly patients, they often have a lot of other medications as well. So we have the issue of polypharmacy and medication errors associated with contraindicated medications unintentionally. Also, it can be hard for elderly patients to read if the font's very small or it's not easy to see the leaflets. And then they have issues with impaired swallowing as well, which can then lead to errors there. Patients with visual impairment, here picked out specifically with regards to more likely to use eye drops, and it can be very difficult on eye drops to actually have the right font. So there needs to be consideration given to that, looking at perhaps Braille or increasing font size, or certainly getting that information to the patient in some way so that they are aware of exactly how they should be using the product. Now, as with all risk minimization, you do have to evaluate the effectiveness of the prevention, and there are different ways of doing this. You can use your national reporting systems, and they often collect data on medication errors, so you can use that as outcome data. Most common is the spontaneous reporting, but we do know the limitations around that. You could do a post-authorization safety study, and that would be useful if there are safety communications in some way, or if there's a label change, you may want to do that then to look at the pattern of use following that. And then you can have a survey or questionnaire to see if there is an understanding with regards to the specific error that you have been trying to minimize. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the PBRER, PSUR, and the fact that, and actually it goes to the R&P as well, and the fact that you have to put, you have to summarize medication errors in your PBRER. And as you can see from the coding aspect, it's actually quite difficult to pick out exactly what's going on if your medication errors haven't been coded properly. And what you'll get is a bit of a data dump and lots of cases, and you can't really see a pattern because you've got 100 cases of medication error, but it doesn't tell you anything about where those errors have occurred in the process. And you can't really see what the root cause is, and you need to understand the root cause so that you can understand what changes do need to be made for your product. So the way that I've looked at this is to have a kind of a double column list, and in the first column you have more detail, and in the second column you have a category. So you can see here, we've got here administration, so sublingual, oral, rectal, and you could create this separately for each of your products. You can have a generic list as well, but you can create this separately and add in things that are more relevant for your product depending on what type of product you have. So in this one, the product should not have been given in this way, but was crushed tablet, dissolved tablet, unintentional, of course, because we're looking at medication errors. And then what I tend to do is put the cases in here, and then you have a drop down. You click your whatever it is, the accidental overdose, lowering dose, and then it automatically populates the category here, overdose, dose. And then what you can do is filter on this, and you can see, right, I've had 20 cases related to dosing, of which 10 cases were lowering the dose, and then in the comments you'd put kind of the root cause, and that will enable you to see any specific or particular patterns that are occurring with your product. We had one product where actually what you were seeing was incorrect mixing up from an IV perspective. They were using the wrong solution to mix up with. And so you'd have it as administration, and you'd have incorrect, IV infusion, and then you would put the root cause here, and you could see that actually that was becoming an issue, whereas if you just looked at medication error, you wouldn't be able to pick that up. And then from that, you can say, well, actually, yes, I can see here that we've got a lot of issue associated with the dosing, and in particular with, or administration, and in particular with mixing up of that infusion. We need to make sure the labeling is appropriate and it's very clear as to what you should be using to mix up that infusion. Also, when you're writing then your PBRER and your PSUR summary, your RMP, it's easier to write it because you can say, 20 cases were received relating to dose, of which 5 were related to lower dose, 6 were related to this, and it just helps you to put that together in a much better way in your PBRER. So that's all I'm going to say. We've come up to 11:30. I think it is really important to understand that medication errors mainly are preventable. The collection and coding is important. Coding is a problem and does need to be looked at within organisations. You need to be able to pull out the right cases, the right information to be able to assess this. Further classification is needed to understand the root cause, and you probably do need something like that spreadsheet that I showed you to be able to assess what's going on and summarise appropriately for your report, but also for signal management as well. Risk minimization is important, usually routine. However, additional may be required for complex drugs or where patients are there's a specific patient population that needs to be treated or could experience that medication error. So I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions? I'm not quite sure if I can see the chat. Ah, it's come up now. So Friel's just written, hi Seema, recoding the example at dentist. Does it mean that accidental inhalation and occupational inhalation? So that's a good point. I would code both. Yes, I think it's better to code both than to miss out one of the codes because you're relying on your coding to be able to pull out the right information. So if you're looking for occupational exposure, you'd want that as well as the medication error. And then Gora's written, now we see lots of cases coming from PSPs, most poorly documented, giving more of a mechanical look. For this, we may also receive practical for improving the data by MAH. Yes, I think unfortunately it is, and that's why follow-up is really important. But of course, if you've got a patient support program, it's going to be really that information through. And then what you do end up with is an increase in medication errors that don't give you anything further to really say what the issue is. And then, yes, you could be requested to go back and look at that. Are there any other questions or comments? No? Okay, well, I shall... Oh, Gora's typing. Or not. Oh, right, you're welcome. I hope that was useful. I think it is an area that we do need to look into. We need to understand a little bit more. It is that old caveat, if you could put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. So it is really important to understand how these situations should be entered onto your database or wherever they're entered so that you know what you're looking at. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, guys. I'm glad that was interesting. And please do feedback also on any other topics that you would like us to cover or hear more about as well. Thank you.